You know, Chevy, if you'd done the Detroit Grand Prix at a nice, smooth, big, wide super speedway like Michigan International, maybe even make that a 500-mile race while you're at it, you probably wouldn't have had the pace car hit a bump and crash like you did at the bumpy and difficult street circuit at Belle Isle. Just saying. So let's get it out of the way first and foremost. Before the second duel in Detroit on Sunday, before the cars had even really gotten out of the pits, the pace car was involved in a bizarre incident where it went over the rise heading down the straightaway into turn 3. It caught it for whatever reason. It lit the rear wheels on the 750 horsepower Corvette ZR1 and shot it heavily into the inside wall. Now, thankfully, and first and foremost, both of the passengers of that pace car were okay, unharmed, and outside of very harmed pride, they will be okay. Now, the driver, which for whatever reason, not really sure why, it definitely seemed like a very NASCAR on Foxy thing to do for ABC. They called it a celebrity pace car driver throughout. It was actually one of the GM executives named Mark Russ. Now, Mark Russ is one of the guys who is instrumental in Chevrolet's and General Motors' motorsports activities. So he's a guy who's apparently been around the sport for quite a while and simply made a mistake. Apparently, he's driven the pace car several times for the Detroit Grand Prix on other occasions. So really, he was experienced, and just for whatever reason, I don't want to necessarily speculate that maybe he had the traction control off when he shouldn't have been. He hit the wall, and it happens to all of us. And you know, unfortunately, his big embarrassing moment of the day happened in front of millions of TV viewers, and certainly even more, hundreds of thousands and possibly even millions of people saw that after the fact, after all of the sports yak and sports joke accounts got a hold of that, retweeted it, and kind of made a meme out of it. Now, again, it's a tough track, Belle Isle, no doubt about it. Again, I made a joke in the beginning, like, well, if you'd run it at Michigan Speedway, that probably wouldn't have happened. Yeah, of course it probably wouldn't have happened. But at the same time, I do have to kind of wonder why. I can understand maybe for the Indianapolis 500, because even though that track is, of course, one of the most difficult in the world in terms of running it at 230 miles an hour, running 100 miles an hour around there in a specially prepared pace car isn't necessarily the hardest thing to do, and with a day or two of training, you can pull that off. Driving the street circuit is much different, and so I would probably suggest to IndyCar and the organizers, especially of street events, maybe cool it on the celebrity pace car drivers. Certainly once Oriol Servia got out there, or, you know, even a Johnny Rutherford if we go back in the day, or a Sarah Fisher who also shares the duties of driving the pace car with Oriol Servia, that you probably wouldn't ever... that would ever be a problem. Even Arie Luyendyk Jr., who was driving the two-seater, you know, and he's not particularly known as the greatest race car driver in the world, was pretty easily able to get around the Belle Isle street circuit in the two-seater. So, again, you should probably have somebody with some racing experience, or at least some experience driving maybe twice the speed the pace car does on the city streets, so they know how to react to certain situations, like having the wheels light up over a crest of the hill. But again, I'm trying not to make too much light of the situation because it was fairly serious, and yeah, somebody could have gotten hurt. Thankfully, everybody was okay, but I think we're going to have to look at celebrity pace car drivers on certain tracks going forward. So let's back the clock up to race 1. And race 1, while generally Detroit races aren't all that interesting, the hype train was a chugging into the station because Marco Andretti somehow qualified on the pole. And by somehow, he did it by almost a full second over the field. How the heck did he do that? I'll never know. It may have been one of the greatest laps of Marco Andretti's life, but regardless, he got on the pole, and so everybody suddenly went from the Marco hate train to the Marco excitement train, the Marco hype train, and it looked like maybe it was going to pay off because Marco did a really good, solid stint to start off the race. He led from the drop with the green flag, was able to hold off Scott Dixon, and I think that's key. Sure, Dixon probably was saving fuel, and that will come into play later, but again, Marco did a fantastic job early on in this race, controlling the pace and controlling the race, and at the same time, not really holding up the rest of the field. But then we get into Scott Dixon. The pit stops that Scott Dixon's team were able to pull off were 2 seconds faster than Marco's, and that leapfrogged him ahead of Marco Andretti in the race. Now, speaking of pit stops, I have to give a huge shout out to Firestone for the tires that they brought this weekend. The black sidewall primary and the red alternate tires worked exactly the way a spec tire series alternate tire should work, where the drastic performance differences added to the show, added to the excitement, added to the strategy. It was actually kind of rewarding to drivers like Graham Rahal, who early on in the race took black tires when everybody else took reds, and that longevity allowed him to absolutely slingshot his way up into the top 5 and be able to compete with the likes of Dixon and Andretti and Rossi up near the front of the field. Speaking of Rossi, another big point, Rossi drove an absolutely fantastic race. A fantastic race to get third in race 1. There was actually a point where he passed Robert Wickens and actually hit the push-to-pass button. So as he was turning in, he took his hand off the wheel, pushed the push-to-pass button, undercut underneath Rossi, and launched off of turn number 3 and around around Wickens. That was an absolutely amazing move, and it showed a lot of awareness from Alexander Rossi. That's something we don't really talk about a lot in racing for whatever reason, but the awareness there, it was almost like a quarterback in football, kind of seeing the play before it happened and being able to adjust mid-throw to throw it to a different receiver. It was, to use a stick and ball reference, I suppose, that was what it was like. So it was a really impressive drive from Rossi. But it kind of turned into a typical street race towards the end, because Graham Rahal absolutely hit the wall a ton, making a little bit of a mistake catching the curb heading onto the front straightaway, and again a big hit for Rahal. Glad he was all right, though the car may not have been. ABC reported that he went to a backup car, which almost suggests to me that maybe the car was tubbed, but then again, that was a big hit. But you never want to see a chassis get compromised, because that's always a big cost to teams. And then on the restart, Santino Ferrucci, who, despite how his name sounds, is actually an American driver, actually the only American driver right now active in Formula One. He's the test driver for the Haas team, despite what Gunther Steiner said in the past about American drivers. He got the opportunity to fill in for Pietro Fittipaldi at the 19 car for Dale Coyne Racing. He was doing an okay job in race 1. He actually outqualified Bourdais, I think, in both races, but then he got his introduction to IndyCar because Charlie Kimball absolutely ran him over going down the back straightaway, and Ferrucci went for righty and really hit the wall big time. Thankfully, again, he was okay, but he definitely looked shook up. That was probably the biggest crash of his career, kind of something that you really don't see in Europe, the close competition throughout the field, the tightly bunched restarts. And certainly Ferrucci has been spending a lot of time in Europe because of his time in Formula 1 and Formula 2. So, yeah, that was kind of his wake-up call. Wow. Yeah, this is a bit more rough and tumble than what happens in Europe, generally speaking. But then we get back to Dixon. The absolute master of fuel saving, the master of strategy, absolutely dominated the final part of the race, and even holding off Marco and Ryan Hunter-Reay and Alexander Rossi at the end of the race. It was actually pretty interesting from a perspective of the Chevrolet cars at the Chevrolet Belle Isle Grand Prix were absolutely nowhere to be found. Now, many people were speculating, including the Chevy drivers, that the Honda cars have a better torque curve, meaning the cars are able to launch off the corner better, and while the Chevrolet cars have better top end, which we saw at Indianapolis with 230-mile-an-hour laps without a tow in qualifying by Ed Carpenter, and then obviously the race pace by Will Power, showed that they definitely have the legs on the super speedways now, which is kind of funny because with the aero kits it was completely the opposite thing. But now it looks like the Hondas are dominant on the street courses, and it was a Honda like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or something in race 1. It was a really dominant effort, and it's always kind of funny when Honda dominates the Chevrolet race, and maybe even if you go to Toronto, which is a Honda race, or Mid-Ohio, which is a Honda race, and then Chevy dominates, it's always kind of funny. But yeah, Scott Dixon taking the win, tied Michael Andretti at third on the all-time list with 42 wins. Now let's put that into perspective for a second. The only two ahead now of Scott Dixon and Michael Andretti on the all-time list, and it doesn't look like Michael's going to unretire and try to chase this anytime soon, is AJ Foyt and Mario Andretti. Widely considered two of not only the best IndyCar drivers of all time, but two of the best racing drivers of all time. That tells you a little bit something about Scott Dixon. Now, granted, a lot of his wins prior to the merger took place in the IRL, which was a slightly weaker field, and certainly at some points in those IRL days, Ganassi had a distinct advantage, especially when everybody switched to a Dallara chassis and a Honda engine. Suddenly, the Ganassi budget, which was at the peak of the target spending, really seemed to outpace people. Now, that's not to take anything away from Dixon, and certainly A.J. Foyt and Mario Andretti had distinct equipment advantages in their careers. But, again, it's a huge accomplishment for Scott Dixon, and 41 of those 42 wins took place with Ganassi Racing. Only the one, his first one, was with Pac West in 2001 at Nazareth Speedway. Actually, the last kart race at Nazareth. So a little bit of history for Scott Dixon there, and it's kind of fun as well to think that Scott Dixon started his career when Michael Andretti, who he is now tied with on the all-time list, was ending his career towards the beginning of the 2000s. It's kind of fun to have those crossovers with some of the best in the sport. Yeah, sure, Michael raced Mario and AJ, but Mario and AJ weren't particularly competitive when Michael was really at his prime. Same for Scott Dixon and Michael Andretti. They crossed over, but Scott Dixon wasn't really at his prime when Michael was on his way out. So it's just kind of fun to have those crossovers, kind of have those threads, the history of the sport all connecting each other. And because of IndyCar's 100-year history, you can move all that back and kind of go all the way back to the beginning if you want to, when drivers crossed over with one another. Kind of fun, and certainly a great accomplishment for Scott Dixon. So race number 2, we've already talked about the pace car crash, so we don't need to talk about that. This certainly seemed like it was an Alexander Rossi race. He kind of learned his lessons. He even talked about it on ABC during the first duel in Detroit, saying, well, we've got some room to improve. We've got some things we want to try. He tried them, and then in qualifying, which is a wet session, he took the pole position, then led from the drop of the green flag, and it really looked like nobody was going to touch him. Sure, there were a couple of guys, notably Ryan Hunter-Reay, and we'll talk about him here in a second, that were able to come into the lead on the black tire alternate strategy, but it was Rossi's race. He looked very controlling. It didn't even look like a guy like Scott Dixon, Will Power, Ed Jones. None of the guys who were kind of running up at the front could really run Rossi down. And speaking of Will Power, real quick, big shout out to Will. He kind of overcame the Chevy's shortcomings to be able to launch himself up into that top 10. I think a drive like that for Will Power is going to speak volumes later on in the season for his championship hopes, because when his car was not the best, he was still able to get a great result out of it. So let's keep that in mind for the rest of the season, especially now that we're past the Indy 500. The championship talk is really going to ratchet up, because now it's like, okay, it's crunch time. It's the second half of the season. What's going to happen? Well, that was a big key. Another big key was the end of the race, and that's where we get into the Ryan Hunter-Reay strategy, which of course was going to black wall tires fairly early on in the stint, and then getting into clean air, and absolutely laying down some of the best laps ever on a street circuit. And I'm not even concerned about making a bold hot take on that one. I think Ryan Hunter-Reay drove one of the best races he's ever driven in his career, probably the best one he'll ever have, period. Just in terms of the qualifying laps, the gap he had over the leaders when he was catching up the pack, just, I mean, it wasn't the most exciting race. There's no doubt about it. The passing wasn't quite there that I think a lot of people may have expected. But a race like this, where you have the guy who's leading the race for the entire thing, you think he's unbeatable, like Alexander Rossi, and then you have a guy step up, catch up to that guy, and then put the pressure on like we saw with Ryan Hunter-Reay and Alexander Rossi. That is racing to me. That is such good racing. It doesn't even really have to end in an on-track pass, which we saw here. Now, this is a big key. Again, we talk championship. We talk Alexander Rossi, who was leading the points going into this race and was looking like, even if he finished second, was going to have a huge points advantage going into the next race at Texas. What happens? Well, his crew radios in, hey, let's think big picture here. Let's think championship. You can let Ryan Hunter-Reay by. He's a teammate. Let's get an Andretti Autosport 1-2. Let's get Honda on the podium with a lockout. How cool would that be? Unfortunately, Rossi thought it would be a good idea to really race Ryan Hunter-Reay. Now, of course, these are the two best drivers on the Andretti Autosport team. And I think some of it, and this is total speculation on my part, I think some of it is Rossi's attitude coming from Formula One. You have to be better than your teammate every single race. And if you're not the top dog and you're not getting the best equipment. Now, do I think that's the case at Andretti Autosport? Absolutely not. But I think Rossi, in his upbringing, his European upbringing in terms of racing, was thinking, I've got to keep Ryan Hunter-Reay behind me because otherwise I'm going to be in trouble with the team. I'm no longer the top dog. And certainly Rossi seemed like the top dog recently. Unfortunately, again, he wasn't thinking big picture in a series as competitive as IndyCar. You can't do what Rossi did and lock the brakes up, eat the tires absolutely alive, despite the fact that they were already going off at that point, and then slide into the runoff area and finish 13th. That is not championship racing. And I think we're going to look at this race come the end of the season and we're going to say, that's where Rossi lost the championship. This may have been a championship losing thing for Rossi. And it's a shame because, well, it was kind of funny as well because ABC kind of did the commentator's curse on him because about 10 laps to go, they were really talking up how Rossi's like the next great thing. And believe me, people like me have said that too, so I'm not blaming ABC on that one. But then here comes Ryan Hunter-Reay, and then Rossi makes the mistake and loses the race. And it's just, I don't know what maybe he was thinking. It's also kind of funny too because Rossi was complaining an awful lot about Marco holding him up the race before and then kind of softened his comments later. Probably another kind of F1 style thing where he was softening his public comments and maybe not so soft in the backroom meetings. But he said that Marco probably didn't push his tires hard enough at the start of the race and that's why he fell back to Dixon. Well, what happened when he pushed the tires too hard? They fell off dramatically, and when he tried to mount a challenge to Ryan Hunter-Reay, who was on much fresher tires, it didn't work. So it was Ryan Hunter-Reay who took the victory, and just, I mean, again, I said it before, I'll say it again, one of the best victories of his career, one of the best drives we've seen out of an IndyCar driver in a very long time. Again, in such a tightly controlled, almost spec series, I won't say it's completely spec, but that is just otherworldly. Sure, he was on a better strategy, but it was clear from the radio communications from his crew that he absolutely drove and won that race for them. You can put the driver on the best strategy in the entire world, but if they don't have the chops, if they don't have that X factor that makes them be able to run a second a lap faster than everybody else, you're not going to win the race. And that's what happened with Ryan Hunter-Reay. Man, what a fantastic drive. And then he gets out of the car and is very humble in his interview. Thanks his kids, thanks his wife, thanks his crew. There's a reason that Eddie Cheever, and this is one of his better lines, calls him Captain America because he really is kind of the guy who should have been the face of the series. And again, that's kind of one of those things that we go back to even 2012 when we say, why the hell didn't you promote this guy when you had the chance, IndyCar? 2014 too, he was your Indy 500 champion and you didn't promote him. Of course, then you can run into the people who say, well, they're promoting Joseph Newgarden too much. I'm like, well, you've got to choose here. Do you want to promote your stars or do you not want to promote your stars? But thankfully, it's his first win since Pocono 2015. A lot of people were wondering if he'd ever win again. I mean, this is such a competitive series, and once you get kind of up there in age, you got to wonder if he's ever going to do it again. I kind of likened him chasing down Alexander Rossi as if Jimmy Vasser in the Target days had actually been able to chase down, catch, pass, and outthink an Alex Zanardi or a Juan Pablo Montoya. I've always kind of thought Ryan Hunter-Reay is kind of that same ilk as Jimmy Vasser, kind of that same career path. But it's kind of nice that he kind of burst out of that Jimmy Vasser getting kind of bested by your younger, more aggressive teammate, and he just drove a smarter race. It was just fantastic. And then he mounted the line at the end, and that was hilarious. I hope that if Detroit comes back, there's some talk about that it won't come back for next year. But if that comes back, that needs to be a tradition. They need to mount the line every year because that's hilarious. Well, you knew this was coming. It was the last race for the ABC ESPN network, at least for the very foreseeable future, in terms of IndyCar coverage. And I know a lot of people are expecting me to pop the champagne, pop the confetti, and spike the football about how much I am happy that ABC is gone. And sure, they had a lot of bad moments, particularly in the last 10 years. Something about Todd Harris saying if Danica could turn the trick, and Rusty Wallace calling the Indy 500 the Daytona 500 during perhaps the most dramatic finish of the last 20 years. But if you go a little bit further back and you think about Paul Page and Jim McKay and hell, even Jim Lampley, there was a lot of respect shown towards the sport of IndyCar racing, a lot of innovations, a lot of true passion that went into the broadcast, bringing IndyCar racing to our homes. And while those final years certainly sucked, you think about, look at all the things on my channel, Indy 500 month. Most of the things are inspired by the things that ABC used to do. The Tom Blades Europe introduction of the drivers, that is ABC. The detailed starting grids, ABC. All these things, the stories told about the drivers, the stories told about the cars. This is all, ABC helped shape the motorsports landscape with their coverage. Yeah, sure, the Daytona 500 was the first full-length live major race shown, but they were kind of done in the ilk of the ABC Wide World of Sports broadcasts, where you'd have a full team, you'd have some motorsports experts, you'd bring in Jackie Stewart to talk about the driver's perspective. Onboard cameras were something that I think ABC helped pioneer and certainly continued to help pioneer. They were the first ones with the really HD helmet cams that we saw debut last year. But, of course, going forward, it's going to be pretty nice to have NBC. Just work on that theme, NBC. Your theme sucks. So, remember, you know that IndyCar theme that ABC does? Yeah, just copy that. Just copy. Actually, I had a suggestion from my friend Kale on Twitter to get the guy who does the Project Cars 2 theme. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, so call him up, tell him to compose an IndyCar theme for NBC next year, and we're all good. But yeah, thanks to ABC, and I'm going to say it, thanks to ABC for your coverage, but I don't think we're necessarily going to miss you going forward. It's one of those things where it's like, they really stopped caring. They started treating IndyCar like a stepchild, and really the relationship lasted way longer than it should have. And again, I think that kind of speaks to the IMS mindset of we've got to have traditions. Well, some traditions need to be broken. This one was, and it'll be exciting to see what happens going forward. All right, so Texas Motor Speedway is next. Oh boy, this is the race that I always fear. It's the race that always seems to turn into an absolute bleep show. There always seems to be a big talking point. I'm hoping that everybody stays safe. I'm hoping it's a fairly competitive race, though I am fearing there's going to be the annual Texas drama where there's one half of the fan base that absolutely despises the racing and another half that actually likes it, and there'll be a big war, and then there'll be people who say, I'm not watching IndyCar racing until the next oval race. And then there's the guys who'll be like, they're going to kill somebody. Racing's too dangerous. It's going to be somewhere in between that. But again, I hope it's a safe race. I hope it's a competitive race. It'll be fun to see. I love oval track racing, but sometimes Texas makes me want to close my eyes. So until then, that's only next week. So you only got to wait a week for the next IndyCar Red Pill. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hit the like. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of the weekend. And if you have any thoughts that maybe I didn't cover here, let's discuss it in the comments. Let's get a big discussion going. And we'll see you in the next video. Be sure to subscribe for more motorsport, IndyCar, and just, well, we got some Le Mans coverage coming up too. I know this isn't the Le Mans Red Pill, but might as well throw that out there. That's coming very soon. Thank you guys so much for watching.